I'd like to start by thanking Elena Yee, who invited me to give this lecture. Elena is no longer here, but her spirit and the work that she's done with intercultural programs was something that we all appreciate. And I'd also like to thank Diane Liu, who sort of took up the baton from Elena and has continued to do such good work here at Westmont in making this a campus that's more inclusive, making this a campus that is more open. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. I think that we all have a lot to learn from Martin Luther King, and I hope today we can not only listen to this talk, but also engage in conversations about his legacy and that wider structural questions that he was concerned about and he was interested in transforming, okay? So we owe much to the African-American tradition, primarily participatory freedom, the freedom to be an equal and full participant in governance, in association and critique of the society. I think what has not been appreciated, or not been appreciated very much within the United States, is how African Americans articulated their struggle for freedom through and within robust and vibrant intellectual traditions. In other words, that it wasn't just simply a struggle, political struggle as we understand it, but also that they debated and argued and reflected deeply about deep questions in ethics, epistemology, in politics, and so on. But first I want to sort of preface my remarks by reflecting briefly on the idea of an intellectual tradition. I just want to start that off because I think it's important to get a sense of what I mean by an intellectual tradition. I think, of course, it's very important to understand the African-American tradition, intellectual tradition, because of the intrinsically valuable knowledge that we can learn from it, right? If we pay attention to this tradition, we may stand to learn about all those things that I've talked about, epistemology, ethics, and so on, okay? But I think we also stand a lot to gain by maybe reflecting on how African Americans have transformed our whole idea of tradition in the first place. They have transformed how we understand a tradition, right? For most African Americans, they've thought of tradition not as this linear process that has an origin and has this sort of, we are moving from, say, Plato to Aristotle to Augustine and so on, but they've thought of tradition in a much more diverse ways, as something that is articulated, not something that is sort of just handed down, right? So I think maybe in our conversation we can reflect more on that idea of tradition. I just wanted to give you a sense that it's not a simplistic, African Americans don't understand tradition in a simplistic way as that's something that is handed over to them. Okay, so what I want to do today is twofold. First, I want to offer a very broad outline of two African-American intellectual traditions, okay? And those two traditions are prophecy and wisdom. And second, I want to make some remarks about Martin Luther King and his contribution to these intellectual traditions. So my first part of the lecture is just dealing generally with this great, vibrant, robust African-American ways of thought, ideas. But then secondly, I want to go into how Martin Luther King is embedded in those traditions and how he contributes to it, and also how the traditions critique him, right? Because we want to understand Martin Luther King here as a human being who had lots of flaws, but also was a great exemplar. So let me first turn to that idea, that intellectual tradition. I want to start first with prophecy. Now, prophecy as an institution was a phenomenon that was widely practiced across several polities in Africa, the ancient Near East, and many other parts of the world. the African-American intellectual tradition of prophecy drew from these traditions. But when we talk about prophetic traditions in the United States, we are most familiar with the Puritan prophetic tradition. This was articulated by the likes of Perry Miller, and then some of you have probably read the book, The American Jeremiah by Zach Van Bekovich, who sort of argues for a certain prophetic Puritan tradition. Now, African Americans, of course, were in dialogue with that Puritan tradition, but they were not, but their articulation of a prophetic tradition was not simply derivative of it. It was not simply a mimicking of this prophetic Puritan tradition. They also had some very original ways of thinking, original insights on the prophetic tradition. Okay, so for instance, here's an example. If any of you are students of Frederick Douglass, you know very well that Douglass not only drew a lot from the Puritan tradition, but one of the things that's very interesting about Douglass was his huge secularism. You know, he was very critical of Christianity, especially the Douglass of the 1860s and so on, the one who increasingly became disenchanted with Christianity's role or the church's role in the perpetuation of slavery. So in other words, Douglass was not simply sort of copying the Puritan tradition, but he was very interested in, and he articulated some very original insights on the importance of secularism. Okay. So what were the characteristics of the African-American prophetic tradition? The first is prophets have often been liminal characters. On the one hand, they are conversant with the deep structures of those societies that they are part of, but on the other hand, they are sort of at a relative distance from those traditions, right? From their society. They keep a sort of arm's length distance from their society. Okay? So this raises a question as to where the authority of African American prophets came from. Historically, there have been at least two major streams within which African American prophecy has thrived. The first, of course, are religious institutions such as the Black Church. We know that the Black Church came to assume a very strong central part within the African American tradition, partly because it was one of the places where African Americans could meet without being beaten up or harassed. In a sense, after the Turner revolts, the slave revolts that were sort of led by Turner, just the presence of 2 or 3 African Americans congregated in one place was seen as a very fearful, suspicious thing. And so the church was one of the places where they could engage in that kind of association and maybe plan and resist this oppression. But a second form of prophecy emerges also in African American artistic and aesthetic movements. So we have a different form of prophecy in, for instance, the Harlem Renaissance, you know, and later on the Black Arts movement in the 1960s. That was not a prophetic tradition that was religious at all. It was much more an artistic, aesthetic tradition. Now, there's a very close connection between the African American prophetic form and its content. Both religious and aesthetic forms of prophecy are embodied, they're performative, they're demonstrative, they're even theatrical. Prophets have often sought to make their case by sheer example, by embodied action. You know, there's an example of Sajana Truth, for instance, who makes her arguments in part by bearing her own body, by showing people the scars that she has gone through, that she has suffered through slavery, by, in a sense, using her body as an example, you know, and she makes some strong arguments there for why African American women are not considered women, in a sense, right? Why, in a sense, when we think about women, we think about white women. When we think about blacks, we think about black males, but we don't think a lot about African American women who are, in a sense, raced, but also gendered. So that's part of the Sajana Truth critique. Now, the theatrical, the sort of embodied performative aspect of prophecy can very easily sometimes incur, well, ridicule, right? And prophets often could defy this kind of ridicule because they awed people by their immense charisma, right? They were sort of these electric characters who were very, very powerful, had lots of charisma. And that, in a sense, was enough to silence a lot of their critics, right? So most African-American prophets were some kind of legends, right? They were that powerful in their speech. The African-American prophet also, this is a fourth characteristic, conceived of truth as primary, and therefore they were contemptuous of admonishments for civility, for moderation. They were ruthless in stripping respectability from their critics, from those people who they were opposed to. You know, they sort of saw, a lot of them saw civility as a fig leaf to cover horrific atrocities such as slavery and lynching, right, and racism. And so they were not particularly, gentle with people who argued for civility. Here's Douglas, for instance. He says, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. So this is Douglas arguing against, many times many people told him, well, if only you can phrase your speeches in much more gentle language. If you cannot attack people, maybe that can make it easier. And Douglas was not, he was not particularly enamored by such admonishments. The language and tone of the African-American prophet is charged with urgency and is heedless of calculation and strategy. For the prophet, the time to act is now, right? And yet, because of such a conception of time, they also had this sense that they were operating in an eternal time, not just the exigencies of the moment. For aesthetic or artistic prophets, they are operating in what's called utopian time. They're interested in the longer view of a sort of radical transformation of the society. Prophecy, African-American prophecy has often taken two surprisingly divergent strands. There's one strand that often tends to be exclusivist, separatist, purist, sort of like, let's get together and separate ourselves from these people who are contaminated or are in some way bad, right? Profane. But there's another form of prophecy, a second strand that has often been, especially the artistic strand, that has often been inclusivist and pluralist, cosmopolitan, internationalist, right? So much for those characteristics of prophecy, right? Now let me turn to wisdom. The wisdom tradition within the African-American thought was cultivated in fugitive and irreverent spaces that African Americans could cultivate during and after slavery. So even in the heavily monitored slave quarters, blacks were often able to construct fugitive spaces to employ what Scott has called the weapons of the weak, right? So, you know, when you are a slave, you are subject to so much beatings and even murder, right? So there are some weapons of the weak that they could employ. Now this could include different things like poisoning people or just walking slowly or, you know, doing those things that the weapons of the weak usually employ. Okay. Now in the antebellum period, an organization emerged known as the National Negro Convention Movement, established by blacks to champion black freedom. Okay. And then there were other blacks who started newspapers, such as Douglas, for instance, during slavery. Okay. Later on, after slavery, many African Americans established schools, of course, with the help of sympathetic Caucasians. And African Americans also developed guilds, such as in law, engineering, medicine, and so on. And established institutions such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League later on. What were some of the characteristics of wisdom? Now, the political telos of wisdom has often been varied, but one of the most striking aspects of the wisdom tradition has been its deep intersectional politics. The African American wisdom tradition has championed a politics of the outsider, remarkable for its openness to the outer bounds of belonging. There are at least 5 particular points of articulation of this politics. Okay, the first, as I've already talked about, one strand of that wisdom tradition has been its deep secularism, fierce even secularism. Another strand has been its black feminism, and later on, womanism. Another one has been its queer politics. Another one has been its social democracy. And yet another one has been its internationalism. Its secularism was championed by the likes of Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Baldwin, right? Its feminism and womanism was championed by the likes of Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell. Its queer politics were championed by Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin, and among others. Its social democracy was championed by the likes of Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. Its internationalism was championed by the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, it's interesting, I find, that a lot of these strands have not been are not really known to many people. We talk a lot about African-American prophetic tradition, but we don't talk a lot about its fierce wisdom traditions, including its fierce secularism, queer politics, its openness to internationalism, its great social democratic tradition. One of the deepest cleavages of the wisdom tradition has to do with the question of rationality. One form of wisdom emphasized prudential rationality. This kind of wisdom conceives of politics as the art of the possible. And its politics is kind of pragmatic, instrumental, the making of alliances to suit the exigencies of the moment. A second wisdom tradition tries to focus only on intrinsic goods, and its stance toward politics tends to be that certain goods are so important, certain things are so important that they cannot be bartered or measured and cannot be, in our sense, compromised on. And it also argues that our capacities for understanding and evaluating certain goods is so limited that we cannot measure those goods. Politics within the wisdom tradition has often tended toward the everyday. The wisdom tradition has been concerned with the day-to-day life, has been focused on institution building, it's sort of the politics of the in-between. Between those protests, life has to go on. And that's where the wisdom tradition has been most powerful, right? That every day. And it's also been focused on the politics of the private and the personal. In other words, the wisdom tradition has been very critical of patriarchy within the home, arguing that politics is not only something that you carry out there, but it's also something that is lived in your home. And those hierarchies within the home are just as important as, and need to be critiqued as the outside, the structural, the political. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the wisdom and prophetic traditions are sort of this opposed binary, always already binary opposites, right? They were distinctive traditions, and so that means that often they pulled people to different allegiances. Certain people were led or were sort of brought to think that the prophetic was the best stance. Some were led to think that the wisdom was the best stance. But even though sometimes they clashed, the best within the African American tradition has tried, the best orators, the best rhetors have tried to meld these traditions. You know? So if we see the likes of Douglas, the likes of Harper, Coppin, Ali, Wells, Cooper, Du Bois, Baldwin, I think one argument is that they are so distinctive because they try their best to meld, to weave in the best of the wisdom and prophetic traditions. Okay. My argument will be that King tried as well. King tried to be, in a sense, a wise sage, you can argue, but he also tried to be a prophet. And there's a question there about whether he succeeded, and also there's a question of how coherent sometimes these attempts were. But nevertheless, the best of these orators have tried to do this. So who was Martin Luther King? I want to sort of move then. I've sort of talked about these traditions, and I think we need to understand the African-American tradition as never beginning with King, as somebody that was just embedded in a long-standing, robust tradition, right? But I want to move now to him, to King himself. Who was he? The brief answer is that there was no single king, right? There was no single Martin Luther King. He's arguably the recipient of the greatest number of oxymoronic descriptions, right? Have you noticed that? Sometimes people have called King a radical conservative, others call him a revolutionary reformer. You know, some terms that don't seem to fit in very well or easily. But this is not only because after King's death, many groups quickly moved to appropriate his image and symbol, and we need to understand what the interests of appropriating King's symbol is or serves, but also because, interestingly, because King himself was very, very attuned to the politics of representation, to the politics of how he represented himself and how he represented the African-American cause. The self that King tried to cultivate was protean. And my view is that one of the contributions King made to the intellectual traditions in the United States is that he encourages us to reflect harder on the problem of representation. Right? Now, I think that King's many selves was not simply strategic. I think that it speaks to the fact that subject formation is not the singular unitary thing that traditional theory makes it out to be. In other words, I don't think that, you know, sometimes we talk of our true self, my one true self. I really don't believe that people have one true self, right? Everyone is very complex, we have different selves. But the particular selves we construct are, of course, particular to the context we are embedded in and the form of embodiedness we take. And King's representation of himself was thus not only particular to him, but was also a maneuver aimed at achieving very specific goals. So yes, sometimes we use these different selves to strategically, you know, so we portray a different face to somebody for a certain goal that we have. Now, that goal could be ethical, and that goal sometimes can be unethical. But we all sort of have this different context where we're going to face, we are going to portray a different side to us, a different self that we don't portray in other contexts. Of course, I think to a certain extent, it's only ethical that we do so. The way that I portray myself to my students should be very different from the way that I interact with my colleagues, say. But nevertheless, King was very strategic in this deployment of the many representations. So what guided his representation? First, the society in which he was embedded in had a repertoire of representations that he had to contend with. There were at least 4 major types of representation in King's society, which is our society, the United States society. And I want to sort of use certain technical terms to describe these 4 representations. Please don't hesitate, given our context, given our little intimate context, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask me to explain it further, or during Q&A to ask me to sort of unpack these technical terms or unpack what they mean. Okay? But I'm going to talk about at least 4 representations that were circulating in King's society and that he had to contend with. The first is mimetic representation. The second is iconic. The third is vanguardist. And the fourth is avant-gardist. And I'm going to explain each of those in turn. So I'm going to try to define them. And second, representations of King and his society were also shaped by the constituencies that he had to appeal to. Okay? King had different constituencies. There are different people with different interests. And he had to find a way of persuading, appealing to these people, or confronting these people, critiquing them, right? Even as these people critiqued and opposed him or agreed to support him and so on. In King's society, we can talk about at least, well, we can talk of many constituencies, but very crudely drawn, there were conservatives, right? Conservatives that were a majority white population. There was the New Deal liberals. This was a sort of coalition consisting of this so-called white ethnics, right? Catholics, Jews. They were, I think the New Deal liberals, one can argue, were relatively recent to power, well, in historical time at least, right? So their power was still precarious. We know that, for instance, the Kennedys had to make arguments about why their Catholicism was not going to stand in the way of being Americans to get to power. So Catholics were sort of just barely getting into power. The Jews as well. Jews, at least in the 50s and 60s, we see sort of what many historians and many sociologists have talked of as the acceptance of Jews into whiteness, right? Because we know that race is not something that is sort of just ontological. Race is something that is constructed. And whiteness has changed across American history. Some groups that were considered white in the 19th century, that were not considered white in the 19th century, were suddenly accepted into whiteness in the 20th century. So I think the New Deal coalition was sort of this motley coalition, that was also just relatively recent to power. Amongst blacks as well, there were middle-class blacks, and somebody like Martin Luther King sort of came from a middle-class black background that was very socially conservative, right? There were also poor blacks who were extremely disenfranchised and politically radical. Somehow Martin Luther King had to try and represent himself to these diverse groups and also was represented by these diverse groups in the sense that they had a vision of who he was, right? And so he had to work with that. So he has this repertoire of representations, and he has also to try and represent himself to these diverse groups. How did he do so? How did he try to be appealing? How did he try to be persuasive? Let's start with the first one, mimetic representation. Now, my definition of mimetic representation is this, that mimetic representation seeks to see the world in the order of the uniform, the characteristic, the typical, and the essential. It tends to aim for the totalistic and comprehensive. It claims that what it represents possesses integrity, it's holistic, coherent, united. So constituencies that conceived of the United States in the order of the mimetic had a very essentialist vision of the United States. The United States was one kind of thing, right? Or Americans were one kind of thing, okay? The dominant constituency for mimetic representation were white conservatives. For them, the essence of the country lay in its most powerful factions at its founding, the upper class white males that were its founders. And it also had a certain conception of the only true American. So sometimes we hear talk of somebody is all American or somebody is truly American. Well, the mimetic representation has a very particular view of who that person is. And certainly, they saw somebody like Martin Luther King and his constituency of blacks as alien, everything that was alien to the United States. Now, it wasn't just simply that Martin Luther King's blackness made him sort of alien to the United States. It was also that King had the temerity to critique certain sacralized institutions within the US. One of the things that he did, for instance, was critique the FBI. And that was the time that the FBI was sort of quasi-worshipped. It could do no wrong. So by critiquing this sort of quasi-sacred institution, that made him instantly, in the eyes of Hoover, the FBI director, as a communist, as somebody who was a threat to the national, to the nation. Because to people like Hoover, the United States was exceptional. It was a city on a hill, and its institutions, or rather its national security institutions, were beyond reproach. And King at one time talked of how the FBI looked away as practically African Americans often were assaulted in the law courts, right in front of these agents, and they did nothing about it. That made Hoover not only sort of see him as an alien, but have this personal animosity toward him. Now, the constituency of these conservatives was not the only one with a stake in a mimetic America. If a conservative conception of America holds that the United States is perfect, the New Deal liberals held a Whiggish conception of the United States, according to which America was gradually being perfected with each new year. With every new year, people would grow more and more enlightened. You can see why such a view would regard protests as illegitimate. One simply had to be patient, according to this view, and wait for change to happen. So in protesting, many people felt, a lot of these New Deal liberals felt that this is unnecessary. All we had to do is, one day these people will, America will be what we want, or will become more and more perfect. It was unnecessary. Moreover, the New Deal liberals were desperate not to be red-baited, not to be considered communists, right? So we have, for instance, Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, right? The brother of the president at that time, who told Martin Luther King to disown the communists who were advising him, or the people that the administration considered to be communists. What was King's strategy to this constituency? Well, one strategy was to emphasize his bona fides as an American. For instance, you look at his I Have a Dream speech. It's notable for his references to the Declaration of Independence, his references to Lincoln, for instance. Many of his speeches made reference to America's founding documents. And against the pressure exerted on him to disown his so-called communist associates, King claimed that, strategically, he had a pastoral role that forbade him from excluding anybody from seeking him out and from consulting him. Now, King's message was not always flattering to a mimetic image of America, though certainly we can say that he has been sort of appropriated into this image of America. He also often crafted a very radical message. In this radical vision, King called for what he called a beloved community, according to which there will be full participation of all, including the weakest, in the governance of the country. Second, he argued for what he considered that social change will not just simply happen, but it will happen through what he called creative tension, to attack what he called negative peace. So for him, the idea that somehow we should, for many people at least, there was this idea that, what's the problem exactly? We don't see problems, or we don't see conflict. Why are you causing trouble? And for King, this was a problem. You can imagine, for instance, right now, in Westmont, right? One can think of so many problems that Westmont has. I could think of, for instance, I'll just give an example here. We are sort of a campus that's sort of inaccessible to the disabled, right? But because we are not confronted with this, many of us think there's no problem. And we can say that, wait, there are no people who are disabled here, right? And so we can go on with our lives. And so we need somebody to, and so King sort of thought of that as a negative piece. It's a piece of the grave. It's fine for us, it's peace for us, but it's certainly not peace for that person who cannot get around or who is hurt or in one way or the other, who's not privileged the way we are. So the importance was there it was important to foment conflict, right? It was important to confront people. It was important to cause trouble in order to shatter the myth that everything was fine. Now, King, at a very great cost to his standing within the Johnson administration, would shatter the myth of American exceptionalism by critiquing the Vietnam War. And he lost a lot of standing, right? Because suddenly he was being considered a hippie, he was being considered as a person who was not serious, you know. But he critiqued the idea that the United States could continue to wage this war with all the hardship that it caused. That's mimetic representation. Let me consider another repertoire, another representation, iconic representation. Iconic representation is an order of representation according to the visible, what is seen. Iconic representation is closely connected to the mimetic in that it can stand metonymically for the mimetic. One can argue that iconic representation is a particularly idealized or highly concentrated image of the mimetic. But its manifestation, unlike the mimetic, tends to be toward the sublime, the saintly, the outstanding, the visible. Now, it's very commonplace right now that Martin Luther King, in many senses, performed the classic prophetic role as it's dominantly understood. What is less understood is that King not only performed the role of the prophet, but struggled against it sometimes. Okay? What were the constituencies for iconic representation? Iconic representation as represented, for instance, in the saint, the hero, the Messiah, had a very strong role within a big constituency in the US, which is Christians, right? But it was not only Christians, even within Judaism as well. And King himself was enamored with the figure of the prophet. And he will strike a deep friendship with Rabbi Abraham Heschel, the author of the famous book, the bestseller, The Prophets. And their mutual admiration came from sort of these prophets. They sort of they admired the prophets. But one can argue that they themselves, in one way or the other, did see themselves as prophets in one way or the other. Now, liberal ideology also tended to conceive the world iconically, because a liberal ideology sort of argues for, and I'm talking of liberal ideology here in its classical sense, not Democrats, Republic, but I'm talking of sort of Enlightenment sense. People like, say, Locke or John Stuart Mill. Now, a liberal ideology has an iconic representation because it tends to see the world in terms of the individual, the importance of the individual. Okay. And one of the strongest institutions of liberalism was the news media that was not only guided by a liberal ideology, but whose conventions tended to be focused on the individual. You know? And so one of the things that emerges during Martin Luther King's part of sort of his struggle was that the news media began to cover him as an icon, okay? Here's, for example, a case of Time magazine that had him on the cover, right? So Martin Luther King is Man of the Year, declared Man of the Year in that Time magazine cover, okay? So there's this view of Martin Luther King as an icon. And the news media also tended to cover Martin Luther King's and his struggle the wider freedom rights struggle, the wider civil rights struggle, as really not so much a case of the critical and struggle against racism, but as a horse race between Martin Luther King and some segregationists. So for instance, the news media tended to cover a lot of the events as a horse race between Martin Luther King and somebody like the famous Eugene Bull Connor, the segregationist in Birmingham, the police commissioner of Birmingham. So it sort of reduced the civil rights struggle to be nothing more than a horse race. Who is going to win this time? Who's going to have the greatest exposure? Who's going to have the greatest sympathy with people? So they kind of reduced the whole struggle to a matter of a simple horse race. And they also reductively covered King as the apostle of nonviolence and pitted him against what they considered was the antithesis of King, Malcolm X, right? So, I mean, here is King with Malcolm X, but such pictures were hardly ever shown. Sort of them at this time, you see King and Malcolm X sort of greeting each other. Now, obviously, they often, sometimes somebody like Malcolm X often had very barbed words against King, right? But in the 60s, we see a mellowing of, or a sort of softening of Malcolm X's rhetoric against King, and we see such pictures that were hardly shown. But most of it was sort of a picture of King as sort of, he's the apostle of nonviolence, and Malcolm X is this violent person who is, again, portrayed in the stereotypical terms of the white male, angry, and therefore threatening black man, and so had to be brought down. Now, there was a third constituency, a middle-class black conservatives. Middle-class black conservatives were very, very focused on an ideology of respectability, being respectable. In other words, they sort of wanted to disassociate themselves with the disenfranchised, the very poor blacks. This was a very powerful ideology within a certain middle-class constituency, right? King was not entirely innocent in playing to some of these tendencies to iconize him. He often represented himself to the press as the Negro spokesman. He took pains to ensure that he played to the family values crowd. So here's an example of King who he took a lot of pictures with Time magazine, and they tried to have the domestic scene, sort of King as a good father, you know. Sort of King here is, so there were these pictures of King sort of in this domestic scene and with his children and so on, to portray him as sort of this father who is loving and kind and so on. Now, I want to be clear here that this is not simply a matter of pretense, but I want to be clear that it was strategic, right? It's so important to realize that. And often, King and many of his associates made efforts to portray themselves as respectable, right? Bayard Rustin, the organizational genius behind much of the freedom rights struggle, who was also openly gay, you know, and often was kept in the background. You know, we have this sort of accounts of Bayard Rustin who was sometimes hidden in the trunk of a car so that people don't discredit the civil rights struggle as sort of as having gays amongst them, right? And here also there were just attempts to be respectable, and so that included dressing well, that included sort of attempts to show that the marchers were respectable, right? So there was even the whole idea of the struggle was sort of, and they tried to try and focus on people who would look good in the media, right? I mean, Rosa Parks was very courageous, an amazingly courageous and amazing fighter for freedom, and we all owe her a debt. But certainly there were other women as well who had led in the way of refusing to stand up, to go to the back of the bus, but they were less sympathetic, and therefore they were not iconized. Now, some of these maneuvers are obviously and straightforwardly problematic. Some of them need further critique in the context of the struggle. For instance, I think we can all critique the idea of not being open to gays within the movement. But iconology also does a bad thing in individualizing a struggle. It makes sort of a hero and makes us forget this institutional, structural issues as well. Iconology also, to a certain extent, makes us forget that there were other agents, you know. So the things that were happening in the things that happen even now in terms of racism are not just people, they don't just happen to people. There are certain agents who carry those out as well. So, for instance, few of us, do we remember who James Blake was, for instance? James Blake was the bus driver who asked Rosa Parks to go to the back of the bus, right? We need to remember that the freedom rights struggle was not just sort of this, it had agents. It was not just this passive thing that happened to people, but people were colluding, complicit, and sometimes were part of the oppression as well, right? Let me turn to the third form of representation. That's the Vanguardist representation. This is, by this I mean a kind of representation that one does in the context of politics and law. So for instance, in our political system, some people stand for office and they, in a sense, we vote for them. So they represent us in politics, right? They sort of, we hope, we trust that they're going to be speaking on our behalf or on our interests. Now, this, of course, presented a problem for African Americans because they were, for the most part, excluded from the official channels of political representation. They were, most of them, at least, were prevented from voting and standing for office. So King had a distinct strategy for organizing against racism. The first thing that he tried to do was to establish common institutional bases from which to struggle. King started the struggle from the Baptist Church that he led in Montgomery, and then he started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He then, interestingly, tried to seize control of the National Baptist Convention, the largest voluntary body of African Americans in the United States, but he failed in this. You know, he was actually excommunicated by somebody who was then considered the Negro Pope, Reverend J.H. Jackson. You know, kicked him out of the National Baptist Convention. But even that failure of King to seize this organizational, institutional base proved to be propitious because it ended up that he was then, at least in the eyes of the media, this person marginalized himself by not identifying with this growing body of this momentum for rights. Another plank of King's strategy was to identify interests. We forget that King was often interested in economic issues as well, fighting for people against poverty. He wasn't just talking about, say, reconciliation, but that reconciliation was coming in the midst of structural change for poverty. King sometimes described himself as a democratic socialist, right? The boycott, the successful boycott of Birmingham businesses, for instance, aimed at attacking economic interests of the Birmingham elite. And then yet another plank was direct action. Direct action involved not only sit-ins, but also the organization of freedom rides. Now, this was a very, very controversial thing within the movement as well as without. Within the African American freedom movement, there were many who fetishized the law and were horrified at the deliberate breaking of the law. And many of these people just preferred a strategy of legal petitioning, going to the law courts and suing. So they did not like the idea of sit-ins or direct action. Even white-owned, even so-called liberal newspapers, such as the New York Times, or at least liberal-leaning, or what thought at least to be that way, thought the sit-ins were too provocative. Many other newspapers condemned the sit-ins and condemned the freedom riders as, in a sense, bringing violence onto themselves. Victim blaming was a very prominent aspect of this time. You know? Indeed, when King died, Ronald Reagan, then the governor of California, sort of shook his head rhetorically and said, it's a great tragedy that began when we began compromising with law and order. So there was this idea that somehow, well, you are sort of provoking it, and so you just got what was coming to you. This is a very widespread idea that somehow the direct action was illegitimate. But that was precisely the point, isn't it? Direct action, though, was not only aimed at white conservatives. It was also aimed at building up the habitus of the protesters. It was building up their courage, making them start realizing that they need not fear and they need to stand up against it. And so it had a momentum of its own. When people protested and had these sit-ins, then they developed sort of a habitus, a habit of democracy, a habit of refusing to bow to this thing. So it involved just performing this role and making it come true. So in that sense, it was a very important strategy. The last thing, before I let you go, avant-garde representation. This was primarily aimed at aesthetic, sort of, for King, the struggle wasn't just simply a matter of representing people, but it was also about, according to King, avant-gardist representation is re-representation, or it's performed and instantiated in aesthetic artifacts. So it's all about beauty. It's about creating a certain effect of beauty. And in general, the freedom rights struggle was deeply attuned to the aesthetics of struggle. We see, for instance, the Black Arts movement that emerged. We see the Harlem Writers Guild. King himself always sought to make his speeches not only effective, but beautiful for their own sake. He wanted to sort of draw a vista of what a society could look like that had true reconciliation, that had true structural change. Right? What kind of society do we have where we have an inclusive, open society that we allow for the flourishing of diverse, different people? That's the kind of society he wanted to paint. For instance, that last part of the I Have a Dream, that famous excerpt of the I Have a Dream speech, that was improvised, right? King just improvised it. It wasn't part of, he wanted to sort of end the speech by saying, okay, now these are the three things we need to do. These are the structural things. But he saw that the crowd was desperately in need of a vista of this kind of society where we can, that's beautiful, that we have all races and different genders, different people being truly reconciled. And that's what he tried to aim at in that speech. So he was very attuned to the beauty or the aesthetics of making people envision what this kind of society was. You know? Now, nowadays, when we think of the dream, we think of it as ethereal, as something that is kind of, and many people think of it as something that is kind of, dreams are sort of this thing that you just come up with. But dreams can be powerful in the sense of making us envision a just society that allows room for all. So in all, I think King has a lot to teach us. And perhaps what he has to teach us most is that the freedom rights struggle was not simply about himself. His role was very invaluable. We are in his debt. But he was embedded in a very vibrant, robust traditional praxis, right? In organizations that came before him and that continue. You know. And these organizations had a very intersectional politics aimed at confronting structural racism, fighting for gender rights, struggling for the rights of LGBTQI identities, ending poverty, to have a world where the disabled and the impaired are full participants. Thank you.